So 2 weeks ago, we talked about God's covenantal heart, and I hope it was significant. And I am going to, before we get into today's Bible study, I do want to hear some feedback, like questions or comments or even pushback, because I want to learn from all of you as well. But I heard enough of these comments and encouragement that this perspective on the Old Covenant or the Old Testament might have been somewhat new for some of us, and thinking about what is God's covenant versus the law. And I put myself in that same boat. I'm usually thinking and grew up thinking synonymous with covenant is law, and so I just, the law is just, get rid of it. Why do we, the old covenant, why, and I think the misunderstanding of God's heart happens when we see the Old Testament in that way and understand the Old Testament in that way. And it's so important because it's a foundation for the rest of the Old Testament. And a lot of times we go, that's one aspect of the Old Testament, we go, wow, it seems really inconsistent that God would require all these things to do to earn his relationship, and then Jesus just changes it completely. That's great, but why was God so different in the Old Testament with relating to us as humanity and relationship with him? And so hopefully the biggest image I'd love for you to take away from 2 weeks ago about what covenant means is proposal. It's to think of God's proposal to Israel. And that same covenantal heart continues to us today. We looked at how he chooses Israel. He picks them out. He chooses Abraham. He's this wandering nobody with no family in Iraq. And he says, I choose you. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to bless the entire world through you. Nothing that Abraham did was deserving of that. And so we looked at last time at these different covenants that God establishes, specific things with specific people and groups. And Abraham has his own covenant. And it's different than what we looked at for most of our 2 weeks ago, of Moses' covenant and the law. But he chooses this nomad, this nobody, Abraham, and says, I am going to be your God, you're going to be my people. And so years later, when we looked at Moses, and we'll talk about the law more as we go along, he reestablishes that same covenantal heart with them and says, I am your God, and you're going to be my people. And so Deuteronomy 7 is a great picture of this proposal where this is now with Moses. So they're out in the wilderness, they're at Mount Sinai. This is when Moses gets the 10 Commandments and all the other rules and things, but before he does that, this is what God says to the people of Israel. He says, you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the people on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were the most numerous than other people, for you were the fewest of all. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. That's like a beautiful proposal. That is his proposal to Israel and saying, I choose you, I love you. You didn't earn it. I chose you because of my faithfulness. And so that choice of Israel is the same. That choice of Israel is similar to us today, right? It is by grace you've been saved. Nothing that we have ever done. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. There's nothing deserving in us. We are told in 1 John, we love God not because we know what love is, but because he loved us first. And it's based on grace, and this is that foundation of relationship, and it's based on God's faithful promises. It's based on God's heart for relationship, genuine relationship with his people, and it is in part with his plan to restore all of humanity. He wants all of humanity to come to him. And so if you remember with Abraham, he gives this specific promise, I'm going to give your people a land and be a blessing. And at the very end of that first time, he says, and I'm going to bless the entire world through your family. This open invitation, because we know that through Jesus, that comes to everyone. So Israel's response is really important because we often take the covenant and connect it with the law. And what I hope you also remember from our 2 weeks ago, and hopefully for forever, as you look through the Old Testament, bless you, is that God's covenantal heart, his proposal, his choice, his grace of Israel is different than the law, which is Israel's response. So Israel says, I do. Okay, I do. I will follow you. And there's then expectations for Israel to respond to God. And it's built on these principles to first trust and obey him, to have exclusive intimacy with God, and to be a partner in God's restorative plan to the world. And again, I want to, these things are still true for us now, too, right? Like, if we are in a relationship with God, yes, it's by grace, but we still say yes, and there's still this expectation of, okay, I'm going to trust and obey God. And I'm not going to believe in other worldviews and other gods. I'm not going to be around, and he wants me to be a partner of in his mission work. And again, these are things that, as a husband, I do these all the time. That illustration of marriage is such a great image because my commitment to Jenna means that I do these things daily and over my whole lifetime. Right? Like I trust and obey you. I trust that, right? Like she is the one I go to for her perspective over everyone else. Like we make decisions together. Not like my friends at work and go, hey, what do you think we should do with this? Oh, okay, I'll see if Jenna wants to do that. But like I go to her, like I trust her, like we are on this together. Exclusive intimacy. I have not been dating since about 13 years ago when we started dating, right? Like I'm not going to date anyone else. Exclusive intimacy with her. And then we're in mission together. We have kids, we have purpose, we have people that we're serving as a family because we're in this partnership for a mission and restoration together. And so a lot of times there's this question, how did people in the Old Testament, how did they have a relationship with God? Like, didn't they have to earn it? Like the law, there's 613 rules that regulate worship and sacrifice and priest systems and circumcision and all these weird things. And it seems like this relationship with God had to be earned. And that's not what it's all about at all. Relationship was by faith, even in the Old Testament. Because again, if God's proposal, his choice of free grace, the I do that then Israel sets them up, the other things that come after that is their response. It's the fruit of that relationship. So we look at Romans, and there's other, Hebrews 11, you can look at James, it says this, it was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise, but righteousness that comes by faith. The promise comes by faith so that it may be by grace and guaranteed to all. So we'll talk more about what the law was good for because there was a purpose to it. We're going to do that in 2020. But just as a sneak peek, the law was this tangible way for Israel to respond, those commitments of a spouse to God, and provided identity, tangible identity for them as a people of God. Protection, like most of what God asked them to do was actually for their best. It was for their good to listen. And it was tangible ways of worship and confession. It weren't things that God needed. He says it throughout the Old Testament. It's not like this is brand new when he says it throughout the Old Testament. He's like, I don't actually need sacrifice. Like, I'm God. Like, why would I actually need sacrifice? I don't need to smell dead animals. Like, that's a thing for you so that you can relate to me in a tangible way because you're fallen. You're human. So Jesus and Paul and other writers of the New Testament, they talk about this. They're like, it wasn't that the law was bad. It was that we had an inability to fulfill it. Humanity could not fulfill it. We cannot be the perfect partner for God's standard. And so Jesus comes in as a way of fulfilling all those things. He says, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. He's the perfect priest, the perfect sacrifice, the unblemished lamb, all these things. And what the problem was our unfaithfulness as humanity. And throughout the rest of the Old Testament, we have this continued pattern of the Israelite people where God likens them to a harlot. And you're prostituting yourself out with other gods and other nations. You're not being faithful to your commitment and your covenant to me. And we continue to see God pursuing them in relationship and continue to be faithful until Jesus steps in to be that perfect partner. I think Lindsay sent out an email. There's a great Bible Project video that kind of looks at covenant as well. Takes a different perspective, kind of looking at us as a partner with him. But this is just, I hope it's really good. And I would love to hear feedback. So now that we've recapped a couple weeks ago, I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions or pushback on any of that stuff that we talked about a couple weeks ago. Was it helpful? Was it new? Was it good? Was there still, I'm not sure. Nothing. I see smiles. I heard. Was it helpful? How many found it helpful?
Yeah.
How about show
it? Was helpful. It was helpful.
Okay. Is there any questions still? Any pushback? Any but I don't understand how this fits. What? I heard whispering and what?
I don't know. Did we talk about this? That why do you think that why did he choose a specific people group to show this covenant to when it is for all, but he specifically chose Israel?
Yeah. That's a good question. Thanks, honey. I don't know. I don't really know what I don't know if we have a definite good answer on that. I would say I think it must have been there must have been a method to it, to be able to communicate to the entire planet. How do you do that? And especially in the time when God is choosing Israel to communicate to the world, we're not in the age of internet at that time. These are thousands of years ago. So how do you do that well? And so I think there's probably a reason for choosing a small group of people to broadcast his love and his truth. He can kind of control and contain it rather than, if he puts a billboard in the sky, it might be too much for everyone to handle. I also think on that, one of the most interesting things, and if I do a PhD someday, way after kids, one of the things I would love to study, because I think it's fascinating, is where we get pictures of God working in other people outside the Israelite people, even in the Old Testament. There's a lot of little hints, because if God is only within a certain group of people, then he's not really God. And so he chose the Israelite people to be specially broadcasting who he is. But he was still working in other people. We have lots of other examples of people who know God, even outside of Israel. Before Abraham becomes the father of faith, there's this guy named Melchizedek who blesses Abraham. And he said he's a man of faith, he's a man of God. And so there's a lot of other groups of people or individuals that even in the Old Testament we get this, God is still at work outside of just the Israelite people. So that's my answer. I don't know exactly, but Jade, yeah.
That just jogged my memory of when I went to Wyden, there was one of the teams went to some tribe. Oh my gosh, I don't know where. Some tribe that's not heard of, and they were pretty much mimicking all of God's plan for sacrifice and understanding how they related to one another, but they didn't name anything God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, any of these things, but I just remember the team being they're doing, they somehow in their understanding, without someone coming and saying this is Jesus, this is God, it was they were accomplishing this thing. And I feel that blew everyone's mind because but they don't even have a Bible.
Right.
They don't even know. They're calling all the wrong, not the right things.
Yeah.
But it just is God is so more so above our thoughts and ways. But I mean, what verse is that? Is it Jesus that says you worship what you don't know?
Yeah, I mean, Paul goes
worshiping in truth and spirit.
Right.
There is a level that needs, but still, God can accomplish his purposes without all those things.
And you get so many stories in different places around the world where dreams, Jesus come to someone in a dream. Muslim converts, people who don't have a Bible in front of them, it's hard because it's of course the Bible, and we want to keep using the Bible because it's so clear. It's a clear revelation of who God is. But we got to be careful. And I love what studying the Bible, but God can work outside of that, because he is more than just this book. And it's, and you go like Paul in Acts, he goes to the Greeks, and they have all this philosophy, and he says, I notice that you have this altar to the unknown God. Like, you're seeking truth. I think I can help you out. And I think that's where we come in and we go, great, God's truth is working. Like, when you speak to someone who doesn't have they don't know Jesus at all, they don't go to church, there's still worth and value and love and truth in them. How can we continue to bring that out and put, hey, you know what? Like, it's not that we're on different sides and we're opposed to one another. There's something in you. I want to point you to what you're looking for. Like, I think Jesus is what you need, and I want to connect those dots, and I want to so yeah, this is such a good question. It's such a good topic. I saw another hand in the back.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment that I think maybe one of the reasons he picked the lineage of Israel is because Jesus was going to come later on in the story.
Yep, he had a plan. Yep. That's good. All right. Good. Cool. Well, this morning we're going to look at the Gospel of the Passover. Oh, there's that. That's a good. You should watch that. The Gospel of the Passover, and again, our theme of why read the Old Testament. I've given you 4 C's, and I hope as we look through even Passover, you get a little bit more context for what is the Passover? Why is it so significant? Even context for why it's such a big deal for Jesus. And see the consistency from the Old Testament in through Jesus and beyond, and see what God is communicating about himself and ultimately pointing to Christ in through it all. So let's pray for a second. God, thank you so much for your love and your truth. We thank you that you are a God of grace and that you meet us where we are, and you want to continue to connect with us in genuine relationship. Open our eyes and our hearts this morning to what you want to teach us about who you are. In your name we pray. Amen. So we're going to back up a little bit. So we were talking about Moses a lot and the Mosaic covenant, and we talked about Abraham and Abraham's covenant, which is different than Moses. They're in the same line, but they're different, because we talked about how Moses' covenant was meant to be temporary. Like, God all along knew that this was not going to last, and he was going to need to bring a perfect spouse onto the scene to fulfill it. But with Abraham, right, so he picks him out, he chooses him, I'm going to give you land, you're going to be a great nation, you're going to be a blessing to everyone. And so we start there, and Abraham has a son, Isaac. If you remember that story, God tests his faith, asks him to sacrifice Isaac. God provides a sacrificial goat, all right, in his place, which again is imagery and pointing to Jesus. Isaac has 2 sons. If you remember, they're twins, Jacob and Esau. One's really hairy. One steals the birthright, runs away. That's Jacob. He was the unhairy, cowardly one. But he gets the birthright, and he runs away. At one point, he finds this beautiful woman named Rachel, wants to marry her, works for 7 years to have her hand in marriage, only to be tricked by getting her older, less attractive sister. He works another 7 years. It's just beautiful, right? 14 years of working, and a little weird because you're still married to her sister. But he wrestles with God at one point, and God renames him and gives him the name Israel. Okay, so Jacob has got Leah and Rachel, and at the time, they have 10 sons with Leah, and then 2 sons with Rachel, and because Rachel's the one he really loves and favors, like Joseph and Benjamin, her 2 sons are his favorites. So maybe you remember the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors, and his brothers are fed up and jealous, and they sell him into Egypt. God uses his story to redeem him and brings him up to be like the number 2 guy in Egypt, and interprets Pharaoh's dreams and can predict that there's going to be 7 years of famine. And when they do, then all of Jacob and his family, all of Israel, all his brothers, which at this point there's like 70 of them, come down to Egypt to flee from this drought. And they're very prosperous, and they start growing, and they're being successful, and they're getting bigger and bigger, and they're doing well. At the end of Genesis, Joseph is about to die, and he's giving these words. Hey, we're still going to go back to the land that God promised Abraham. This isn't our home, but we're doing well here, so keep, this is good. This is a good thing. Exodus starts, and there's a new Pharaoh, and he does not like Joseph's family because they're getting, this group from outside of Egypt, and they're getting bigger, and they're doing well. What if they turn on us? So they start to enslave the Israelite people. And so we get to the beginning of Exodus. They have now taken this large and prosperous people and enslaved them. And for one thing, like a misunderstanding, a lot of times we go, man, yeah, they built the pyramids. Like Egypt, pyramids were built hundreds and hundreds of years before Israel was enslaved. So just so you know, they did have them forced labor. They were making them build cities in Egypt, and it was oppressive, and yet they're still growing. Like they're still getting bigger and bigger. So the Pharaoh goes, all right, like we're not been hard enough. Kill them. Like let's just get rid of them. He decrees and all the baby boys to be killed and drowned. And then we have Moses, right? His mom and his sister save him in the basket. Pharaoh's daughter eventually just picks him up, and he's raised in the palace. So there we are, right? So we're in Egypt all together for about 430 years, and depending on what the timeline is, it's not really clear how many of those years were in slavery. It could be like up to that 400, could be at least 120, it doesn't matter. They've been enslaved. And that kind of mentality on a group of people, on an individual, is incredibly destructive, incredibly damaging on any number of levels, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, relationally, and all these things. And it just can destroy a group of people. And we have this reminder that God has God forgotten his people? You're in this group, this place of incredible prosperity. Like Egypt at this time, just they're so advanced in engineering and architecture. Like today, you may still hear people, like very, very smart people go, we still don't really know how they did this. Like, we don't know how they figured this out. Maybe aliens did it. Like, that's how crazy advanced they were, that today, people think that maybe aliens built pyramids and some of the stuff that the Egyptians did. So advanced. So their culture, their military strength, so advanced, and but very arrogant. If you're the top dog, you are very arrogant. You are not a nice group of people usually. At the same time, the empire was also very poor in sanitation. They didn't have every advancement, like in medical and science wasn't actually always the top of the an example, like I know we have a lot of crunchy moms. Is that still a thing? Right? Like, so essential oils and stuff. So like we do it. That's what we do. So, but so example, we have records of Egyptian medicines where almost all of their medicines were combined with animal dung. So like that's super crunchy, right? Like that's super but really not actually good. So as advanced as they were in some areas, also very poor in some other areas. And the religious system of the day. They had over 100 different gods. They had 8 to 10 who were the top dogs that governed different parts of life. And so the worship of these gods was to appease them. You had to appease these gods who were very two-faced, very fickle, capricious. There was like an ongoing soap opera. Like these gods were emotional. If you did the wrong thing, they would smite you, and you would get smoten and smitten and all these things. And it was like if something bad happened, you had to find ways. Okay, which God did I anger? This happened today. Which God do I need to appease? And so when you get to this place, this appeasement-based religion of many gods who were fickle and emotional, but who seem to have great power, because if the philosophy is, hey, if something goes wrong, something caused it, well, I can't see what happened. It must have been this God. And so you have these many gods who control your life, but it creates this atmosphere, even within the religious system, of fear and enslavement. So Israel at that time. So if you notice in Exodus, you start to see that the people of God are called the Hebrews. So they're not being named as Israel. They've lost their identity. They're not all together as just one family of Abraham, children of the promise. They are now slaves. They're oppressed into hard labor by this ruler who has viewed himself as this demigod. They're in a very poor area of the country where they're getting even less good sanitation and medical attention, even given that the standard was animal dung. But there's probably not a lot of people who are reading and writing anymore. The questions are they telling stories anymore about faith? Do they know God? We know that they've stopped the practice of circumcision, probably to the delight of most of the guys. But in the wilderness later on, God has to reestablish that because that was a sign of identity for them to mark them as different from the rest of the world. So they've lost identity. Are they even familiar with who Yahweh is? They're beaten down by this system of Egyptian religion and power that does seem powerful because it's working, right? Where is God in all of this? But when we look at what God's response to of this fear and enslavement, he says this. When he picks out Moses, he says, I have heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage. I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people. I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord. So first of all, you can do you see some of the proposal language again and the commitment? I am going to do this. I've remembered my covenant. I haven't left you. I'm still your God. I still want you. Even though part of this might feel like it's hopeless, I'm still there. His commitment, his provision, his promise. And so what does he need to do practically? He needs to get them out, right? He needs to break this bondage physically. He needs to take them out of Israel, or out of Egypt. He needs to reestablish emotional, spiritual, relational capital with them. He needs to give them identity back and worth. He needs to discipline Egypt for their irreverence towards God and towards his special people. But he needs to show the people of Israel that his power actually is more powerful than what seems to be governing them now. They've been in fear and enslaved by things that seem to be more powerful than what God is. And so, if you recall, he does this through these plagues, right? These powerful plagues. And it's really interesting, so the Jewish people, and we're going to talk about Passover, they still continue to practice this and remember this year to year. And it's interesting, you can look up some really interesting ways to celebrate with your kids. They've got those eye masks, cut out masks that you can wear. They've got ones for each plague, which is a little disturbing. The firstborn one is someone who's dead. It's weird. But if you remember, right? You remember these maybe from Sunday school. And in Exodus 12, God says to Moses, these plagues are going to go against all the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And we won't get into this too much, even though it's really fascinating. It's not an exact science, but it seems like a lot of these plagues were specifically geared towards some of the aspects of Egyptian culture and religious life. And so we'll go through them just real quick because we don't have time to dig into them. But so, for example, right, so turns the Nile into blood, right? And so Osiris was the god of life and death and resurrection, and also the god of the Nile. And water was the beginning of life, and so God turns it into blood, and we're told that it smells of death throughout the entire land of Egypt. And so this would have been a huge slap into the face of Osiris, the goddess of these things. Okay, wow, okay, so he crushes that stronghold, that fear. The next plague is frogs, and so Hecht is the goddess of fertility and happened to have a frog head as its image. And you'll notice, which is really interesting. Again, this is just conjecture. This is not God said this. This is how he did it. But it seems like maybe this is how he's reigning his power over these things. You'll notice, I think it's in 8:3, it clearly notes that the frogs go up into the bedrooms and into the beds of the Egyptians, which again, the goddess of fertility is this frog-headed goddess. So just really interesting. Gnats or probably lice would have been unclean. It was on everything. The priestly system, they had to be pure and white and clean. And so gnats and lice getting into the fabric would have just been a huge slap in the face and would have ruined a lot of their practices. Flies, maybe an insult to Kephara. Kephara, you can see a beetle-headed god. This god was supposed to, one of the specific things that they prayed to this god for was a protection from ravenous fly swarms, disease to livestock. Apis and Menavis are two of the gods that were associated with animal worship. There's a lot of animal worship. Even remember the Israelites eventually make a golden calf. It's probably an influence from Egyptian worship. And so when disease and the livestock die, the slap in the face of these gods that are supposed to be the protectors of livestock. Boils, the sixth plague, Imhotep was the god of the healing sciences and medical. And so again, what is really interesting is, so they often worshipped by using ashes, okay? And they would mix the ashes, which is, again, bad practice, mixing ashes with some of their medicines. And so, again, Moses comes in and he throws ashes up in the air to start this plague, which, again, could have been this way of, like, slapping in the face. Hey, you think you're so great with your medical science and worshiping this god of that? I'm going to bring boils by the same method that you think you bring healing. Hail, the next plague. Horus, Shu, there's other gods of the sky and the sun and life. Locusts, the next, several gods and goddesses about vegetation and earth that could have been just kind of slapped in the face of where's your gods now? And we get to the ninth plague, probably a pretty clear one. Amen-Ra, the top god. It was the god of light, the chief of the gods. And God turns off the lights. And then the death of the firstborn son, directed against Pharaoh himself, against the whole system of oppressive rule and power of Egypt. And then later, God destroys their military might when the waters crash in on the pursuing army. And with all these plagues, the Israelites are kept safe. And you wonder, if you're this group of people, can you imagine being in that, like, for one thing, what the heck is going on right now? But why are we being kept safe? Like, what is going on? Who is this God that is so powerful over and above all these things that we have been afraid of and enslaved for? He's somehow protecting us. And they do a great job. The Jewish people do this great job of remembering and reflecting on those things. And so God frees the people from Egypt. And he says, before you do, he wants to reshape their view of God. He wants to reestablish and have them tell true stories. And so many practices of the law, the different rituals, the different holidays, bring the people back to what is true and what God is doing. And so they name places after miracles that God does. And they name kids after things that God is doing in their lives. And they have these rituals and practices to constantly tell the children and remind themselves, this is the truth, that we do not live in fear and enslavement. And so if you want, you can earmark this and read the whole chapter, but we're going to look at Exodus chapter 12. And I'm just going to kind of skip through it because it's a lot to read. But this is what God tells the Israelite people before they leave Egypt. He says this: while the Israelites were still in the land of Egypt, the Lord gave the following instructions to Moses and Aaron. Each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice, one animal for each household. The animal you select must be a 1-year-old male, either a sheep or goat with no defects, so unblemished, pure, innocent. On the evening of the 14th day of the first month, sacrifice the lamb or goat, take some of the blood and smear it on the sides and top of the doorframe of the house where you eat the animal. Be fully dressed, wear your sandals, carry your walking stick in hand. Eat the meal with urgency, for this is the Lord's Passover. On the night I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn son and male animal in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. But the blood on the doorpost will serve as a sign, marking the house where you stay. When I see the blood of the lamb, I will pass over you. The plague of death will not touch you. And then he goes on in verse 14 to tell them, commemorate this day, remember this, do this over and over again. And he talks about how they can celebrate the Passover. So you have unleavened bread without yeast. You might be familiar with that. And that was the symbol of they didn't have time for the bread to rise. They were leaving. We're getting out of here. We're getting freedom. We don't have time for the bread. So take unleavened bread. And they have this sacrificial lamb, this unblemished, and the blood that covers them. And God continues to have them do this. And so Seder's. Has anyone been to a Seder? Yes, okay. I mean, they are, sorry, let's go here. This is what I want. This is a very different, so going back to Egyptian, right, the religion is appeasement of these gods, fear and enslavement. God sets up this different way of relating with him, with Israel, that's based on atonement or sacrifice. And the difference between appeasement and atonement is where appeasement is you're trying to figure out how to appease the gods. Atonement, the God is trying to come to you to make things right with what you have done. I'm going to find a way to bring you back to me through my sacrifice, right? And it's such a huge difference because this kind of perspective leads to freedom and new identity through that relationship. And so Seder's, and I'm not an expert, I would highly recommend that you find someone who is an expert, can lead a Seder. I've only gone to a couple of them. But it is, I just want to take a look at what how they practice and the symbolism that is in there because they tell stories of God's rescue. And they do a lot of that through food and songs and hymns and times of prayer while they're eating this meal. Like, you know, they were specifically told to eat while reclining. Like, if you ever noticed that, even in when Jesus does the Passover, they're reclining at the table. And that was because you had to be safe and free to be able to recline. It was a luxury. And so God tells them, recline. You are free. You have the luxury of freedom. Recline when you do this Passover meal, which is cool. And this is very simplified. I'm just going to hit the big things. This is the main symbols up there. And so you have karpas, the vegetable that's dipped in salt water, which is not very tasty. It tastes salty. But it represents the tears of slavery that they were under for so many years. And there's 3 pieces of matzah bread, the unleavened bread. Remember, they don't bake it. We don't have time. You're getting out of here. There's freedom. And one of the steps early on in the meal is you break one of those pieces into 3. You cover it in a linen cloth, and you go and hide it to find it later. It's called the afikomen, and it's just, we'll come back to it. So just remember, afikomen, you hiding piece of bread. Bitter herbs are on the plate as well. Again, dipped into this, often it's called cheroset, I think is what it's pronounced. I just spit on you, sorry, Linda. It's a really sweet dessert, but it's kind of mushy. It's a reminder of the brick and mortar of building these stones and building these cities that they were when they were in slavery. Hard-boiled egg is a reminder of meals that were served before the sacrificial lamb was on the scene. And then the shank bone of the sacrificial lamb itself. And then finally, towards the end of the meal, you go and you find this broken bread, and you get it and you unwrap it from the linen. And it's meant to, it's a representation of the sacrificial lamb. So, I mean, I don't have to point out all the things. Hopefully you're going through and go, oh, I see Jesus in some of those things. And it's so interesting. I was doing some research. This one Jewish source talks about it like this. The afikomen represents our liberation from Egyptian exile. That redemption, however, was not a complete one, as we are still awaiting the final redemption with the coming of Messiah. Setting aside or hiding the larger half of the matzah reminds us that the best, the real redemption is yet to come, still hidden in the future. And so for those that are still under the Jewish faith, not seeing that Jesus has come and redeemed, he is that afikomen, and we get to Jesus when he takes the blood, or when he takes the Passover with his disciples. He sits down, they reclining, they're celebrating the Passover, they're reminding themselves of the stories of rescue and redemption. And then he says, and when they were eating, he took the cup, gave thanks, and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the many forgiveness of sins." Oh, yeah, no, you know what I'm saying. All right, the first one is the bread. Sorry. Jesus took the bread and gave thanks. "Take and eat, this is my body. This is a representation of me. I am the afikomen that you've been waiting for. I am the full redemption and restoration." And then the blood of the Lamb that covers is his blood that he is going to give on the cross. And it's just this beautiful thing. And when Paul says in Corinthians, he says, "Do this as often as you do it, you do this in remembrance of him." So he calls us to continue to remember stories of restoration and rescue and covenant. And this was a big deal for Jesus, and it's a big deal for us. And there's context in there about being liberated and rescued from bondage, being rescued and liberated from fear. So it is this beautiful picture. The Passover is this beautiful picture of the gospel, that atonement, that sacrifice. It sets us free, and it reestablishes our identity as children of God, children of the promise. And we find our worth and relationship in Christ alone. And there's no fear of what has enslaved us, because just like all those gods of Egypt, those false gods have no power. They're lies. And even if we carry around things of our past, and am I worthy, my sins, we're not called to be afraid and enslaved by them, because God proves that he is greater than each and every of those false gods. And then we need to continually remember together, because it's easy to forget. It's easy to go, yeah, but those gods feel really real. Those lies feel really real right now. I don't feel like I'm worthy. I do feel like the brokenness is too big. I do feel like things are not in control. That's when we go, yeah, you got to remember what is God doing, and retell those stories of deliverance to your children, to your spouses, to the people around you, the people who have something in them that you're like, I think you're talking about Jesus. I want to call that out in you and remind you and retell the stories of deliverance. And that is so powerful for our individual walk with the Lord and for the world around us. I want to close and I want to close with this song and just give some time of reflection before we go into small groups, and just think through, what are these things? What is God speaking to you through the Passover, through this escape and release from bondage and fear, and what is he calling us into in our new identity in him?